Good evening. My name is Ashok Kotwal. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Ideas for India. And I would like to welcome you here to this evening's event, which is jointly organized with Indian Statistical Institute, Delhi. Now, presently, the most daunting task for Indian economy is to create jobs. And not just any jobs, but good jobs. But to understand what we mean by good jobs, I just want to take a few minutes of your time to set the context. What is the structure of the labor market in India and what we mean by good jobs. So this table really gives you the composition of India's labor force. So some terminology first. By organized sector, we mean all units which have 10 or more workers, unorganized the rest of the India. And if you look at this fourth column, the percentage of distribution across types, one thing you realize is most of India toils in the unorganized sector. Now, even within the organized sector, there are different categories, right? You have regular workers with long-run contracts, and you have casual workers who are hired and fired and paid on a daily basis. They are the casual workers. But within even the regular worker category, you have workers with formal benefit packages and informal workers who are on the long-run basis, but they don't have really well-defined benefits like social security and so on. Now, one thing you notice right away is that most of the poor reside in the unorganized sector, and also they belong to this category of casual workers in the organized sector. Another thing to note is the last row, which is the workers who are self-employed, and that's a very significant part of India's labor force. That's almost half India's labor force, right? These are self-employed, and by self-employed, we don't mean like, businessmen. This is a residual sector, right? People who are hustling for a livelihood of some kind, they don't have any other job. So these are self-employed people. And again, you see the incidence of poverty in the last column is quite high there, right? Their education levels are low. These are low productivity jobs, right? So what do we mean by good jobs? You notice in the wage index column that, in fact, the relative wage with respect to the regular workers with formal contracts in the organized sector, right, is the highest. The relative wage of all other categories is either less than half for casual workers, as well as it's even less than quarter, right? So what we mean by good jobs here is really the regular workers with long-run contracts with the formal sort of benefit packages, and that constitutes only 8.4% of the total labor force, right? Just to give some context. And when you look at the self-employed and so on, there's a gap there in the wage index because this is all from NSS data put together by Ajit Ghosh in the National Employment Report of last year. And NSS has really no data on the earnings of the self-employed. Okay, so then what are the challenges? Basically, when we mean by creating good jobs, either move people from low productivity activities in unorganized sector to high productivity activities in the organized sector, right? That's one thing. But it's unlikely that the organized sector, which has only 8.4% of the labor force presently, can absorb the rest of the labor force in the foreseeable future. Which means when we talk about creating good jobs, we should also think about improving the productivity in the unorganized sector, especially agriculture. The entire agriculture is an unorganized sector. Okay, then if you look at the 3 decades of growth in Indian economy, what are the salient features, right? First of all, the productivity growth has been lackluster in agriculture, right? The biggest employer of labor, right? The fast growth was really driven by the high-skill service sector, business services, software, IT, we call it, right? And it was triggered mainly by the export demand, but its direct impact on creating employment was very low. So it was a very thin layer of highly skilled people who found productivity growth in this high-tech IT sector, and that's what drove the growth, right? So the GDP grew, didn't create so many jobs, and that's why people started branding it as a jobless growth, right? Now, of course, the income growth in the sectors which were growing fast, these few sectors, it was creating demand for the unorganized sector jobs, mostly in construction, trade, and transportation. But this did not create too many good jobs. These were still fairly low wage, low productivity jobs, right? So this has been the trickle-down process in India. And one of the interesting features, of course, a sort of a puzzling feature, is the data show that the labor force participation rate of working age women had fallen from 37.6% in 2000 to 27.1% in 2012, right? This was only in rural areas. Urban areas, it was low, it kind of stayed about the same, right? And that's a puzzle also to be explained. So given this, I thought this kind of context sets the agenda for today's evening. So what are the questions, right? The important questions. So first of all, how can the productivity of activities in the unorganized sector, both farm and non-farm, be improved? How do we explain the fall in the labor force participation rate of rural women, and what are the implications? Is the manufacturing sector necessary to spread the gains from growth across the population? Some people have suggested that this idea of a manufacture-led growth is a thing of the past. China did it, East Asia, but now you have to depend on the service-led growth. And we found that the Indian growth was service-led, but it did not manage to create a lot of good jobs. Is it possible to create good jobs even through service-led growth? Then lastly, Danny Roderick, amongst others, has written a lot about industrial policy, the role of industrial policy in East Asian success stories. But if, in fact, there is restricted access to the markets of developed countries, right? So the export-led growth is not possible, mainly because there seems to be a rise in the protectionist sentiment in developed countries. Is industrial policy possible? And what I mean by that is then if it's the domestic demand that is determined, that is really all the local industry has, what would we mean by industrial policy? And lastly, the subject that is being talked about a great deal across the world, especially across the developed world. So automation, artificial intelligence, do they pose a danger also to job growth in India? And then a much discussed question, what are the binding constraints on the growth of the organized sector? Credit, domestic demand, several things have been, but what are really the binding constraints?